For 22 years, the Bennett family told everyone Claire didn't exist. She wasn't in the photos on the mantle. She wasn't mentioned at Thanksgiving. She wasn't invited to her own sister's wedding until the final week, and only because someone needed her to cover half the cost of the dress. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, her phone rang, and the name on the screen stopped her cold. Her mother. A woman who hadn't spoken to her in almost a decade was calling at 6 in the morning, and before Claire even answered, she knew something had gone terribly wrong. What she didn't know yet was that the answer would involve a hospital bed, a business on the verge of collapse, a house days from foreclosure, and an inheritance that had disappeared without her ever learning where it went or who had taken it. Claire was the middle child, caught between a brother who could do no wrong and a sister who never had to try. She wasn't neglected in any obvious way. She had clothes, food, a bed. What she didn't have was attention. Her mother forgot her school plays. Her father never asked about her grades. Every small win her brother Daniel had was treated like a national holiday, even the ones that quietly fell apart a few months later, something Claire noticed long before anyone else seemed willing to. There had already been one earlier venture of Daniel's, years before, that had eaten through a chunk of the family's savings and simply never came up again once it failed. Nobody called it a pattern back then. Claire remembered it anyway, filed away without knowing yet why it would matter. She remembered, too, the time Daniel had wrecked their father's car at 17 and told their parents Claire had let him take the keys, a lie that cost her a month of grounding for something she'd had nothing to do with. Daniel never corrected the record, not that week, not ever. Blame in this family had always rolled downhill toward whichever child was least likely to be believed. By 17, when Claire wanted to go to college out of state, her mother told her plainly that the money was already earmarked for Daniel's next business plan. The real break came at 24, over her grandmother's small inheritance. Claire had spent years quietly caring for the woman while her siblings visited twice a year, expecting nothing more than acknowledgement. Instead, her father credited Daniel with the caretaking she alone had done. Her mother said nothing, and when Claire objected, she was called dramatic and ungrateful. Within a year, the calls stopped completely. She built an entirely new life 2 states away, with a husband named Thomas, 2 kids, and a career in medical administration that had nothing to do with any of them. There was one memory Claire kept returning to years later, sharper than any of the vague, accumulated slights that made up most of her childhood. She was 9, and she had spent weeks making her father a birthday card, the kind with glued-on glitter and a drawing of the 2 of them fishing, something they'd done exactly once. He'd set it on the kitchen counter, thanked her without looking up from the newspaper, and by the following week she found it in the recycling, underneath a stack of Daniel's report cards that had been framed instead. She never mentioned it to anyone. She simply understood at 9 years old exactly where she stood. Years later in college, a professor once asked the class to describe their family in one sentence, and Claire wrote, without thinking too hard about it, reliable, but only for other people. She never turned that assignment in. Which is exactly why that 6 a.m. call felt like the ground shifting. Margaret's voice was thin, nothing like the dismissive tone Claire remembered. "Your father had a heart attack 2 nights ago," she said. "We didn't want to worry you." But the illness, it turned out, was only the surface. The mortgage was 2 payments behind, with a third due in under 3 weeks, nearly $9,000 past due in total. The business account was nearly empty. And somewhere in the wreckage was money that should have gone to Claire years ago and never had. Claire asked the only question that mattered. Why call her, of all people? Margaret's answer came slowly. Daniel had quietly walked away from the business 2 years earlier, deep in debts no one had disclosed. Emily, 3 states away, had already made clear on the phone that she just couldn't get involved right now. Claire pressed for specifics, and Margaret admitted, almost as an afterthought, that the bank had already sent a notice threatening to begin foreclosure within the month if payments weren't brought current. Claire, despite everything, was the only one left standing who could actually fix this. Claire didn't answer right away. She hung up, sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, and looked in on her two kids asleep down the hall before saying anything to Thomas at all. Watching them, she thought about the version of family she'd built here, one where nobody kept score of who was loved more, and she wondered what it would mean to walk back into a house that had run on exactly that kind of scorekeeping for her entire childhood. She said nothing to Thomas until morning. When she finally told him, he didn't try to talk her out of going. "What do you need from me if you do this?" he asked, and together they set the boundaries she'd carry in with her. Before she left, she made one more stop, a small law office 2 towns from her own house, wanting to know exactly what she was legally owed. The attorney was blunt. Without a dispute filed years earlier, recovering the inheritance through the courts would take months, cost more than it was worth, and still might fail. If she wanted anything close to justice, she'd have to get it herself, inside that house, not in front of a judge. The attorney also raised something Claire hadn't considered before walking in. If Robert's condition worsened, decisions about his care and his finances would likely fall to whoever held power of attorney, and given how things stood, that authority currently sat entirely with Margaret, who had already proven willing to make questionable calls under pressure. It was a detail that changed the shape of what Claire was walking into. This wasn't only about repairing damage already done. It was about making sure nobody made another unilateral decision like the last one while she wasn't watching. That single conversation changed how she walked back into her parents' lives, less as a daughter hopping to be forgiven for leaving, more as the only adult in the room who actually understood the stakes. She almost turned around in the driveway before she even reached the front door. Sitting in her car outside the house she'd grown up in, she found herself asking, one more time, whether she owed these people anything at all. It was a text from her mother, 3 words, "Please, we need you," that finally got her out of the car. Inside, there was no tearful reunion. Robert barely looked up from the hospital bed, his color still bad, tubes running from his arm to a monitor that beeped steadily in the quiet room. Margaret was already talking logistics before Claire had her coat off, rattling through bill amounts and due dates like she'd rehearsed the list in the parking lot. "The mortgage company called again this morning," she said, not quite meeting Claire's eyes. No apology, no acknowledgement of the silence. Just a list. Medical bills piling up, a mortgage payment already late, and a business account that didn't add up. Numbers quietly disappearing in ways nobody in the family seemed able or willing to explain. Robert's cardiologist pulled Claire aside on her second day at the hospital and told her plainly that the attack had almost certainly been triggered by stress, months of it, the kind that builds quietly under a person who refuses to say out loud how bad things have actually gotten. That conversation reframed everything for Claire. This wasn't simply a financial mess she'd been called in to untangle. Her father's body had been keeping score of every unspoken crisis in that house long before anyone bothered to tell her about a single one of them. A foreclosure notice arrived by mail that same afternoon, an official countdown now taped to the refrigerator instead of buried in a drawer, 19 days until the bank would begin proceedings. Whatever time Claire thought she had to figure this out quietly had just gotten a great deal shorter. It didn't take Claire long to notice the withdrawals didn't match anything on the books. Her first thought was fraud, some stranger preying on aging parents distracted by illness. A call to the bank's fraud department ruled that out fast. Whoever moved that money had a password, a signature, real access, which meant someone inside this family had been quietly bleeding it for a long time. For a brief, uneasy day, Claire wondered if her mother herself might be quietly siphoning money out of fear, some instinct to hide cash away in case things got worse. It wouldn't have been the cruelest thing Margaret had ever done, only the most understandable. A look through a separate, smaller savings account ruled that out fast. Margaret hadn't hidden a dollar for herself. She asked who else could touch the accounts. Margaret answered a little too fast, only she and Robert. The bank's own authorization list said otherwise. One other name had access added years earlier for what was supposedly routine paperwork and never removed since: Daniel. An old family friend who'd once done the business's books off the record called Claire back that same afternoon, cautious and clearly uncomfortable, and mentioned that Daniel had asked him, quietly, over a year ago, about how to move money between accounts without drawing attention from an accountant. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Claire thought about nothing else for the rest of the day. That night she found a second thread of the same pattern buried in an old email chain on her mother's laptop, Daniel asking Robert for just a little more, temporarily, in a message dated almost exactly a year before the business finally collapsed. Nobody had ever called it a loan. Nobody had ever called it anything at all. 2 days later, Claire tracked down a man named Gary Whitfield, who had briefly partnered with Daniel on the failed expansion before pulling out abruptly. Gary was reluctant to talk at first, but once Claire explained why she was asking, he stopped holding back. Daniel, he said, had asked him more than once about structuring payments so they wouldn't show up as a single large transaction, the same trick people use to avoid a bank's reporting threshold. Gary had walked away from the partnership specifically because of it, and had quietly warned a mutual friend to be careful lending Daniel money the following year. Nobody in the Bennett family had ever heard about any of it. Before he hung up, Gary said one more thing that stayed with Claire for days afterward. He said Daniel had once told him, half joking, that their parents would always cover for him no matter what he did, because they always had. Gary had laughed along with it at the time. He didn't sound like he found it funny anymore. She briefly wondered if Emily, distant as she was, might somehow be tied to it too. A few hours cross-checking statements ruled that out completely. Emily's absence was exactly what it looked like on the surface, disengagement, not concealment. That left Daniel, and once Claire started looking specifically at him, the pattern was ugly and consistent. 3 withdrawals over 18 months, each one landing suspiciously close to a conversation Daniel had mentioned about his business needing what he called bridge funding. Suspicious. Still not proof, but enough to stop looking outward and start looking directly at the person already sitting across the dinner table from her. The proof came on the 4th night, in a file box in the hallway closet Margaret had specifically told her not to touch. Buried at the bottom was a sealed envelope in her grandmother's handwriting, the seal still unbroken after all these years. Claire's hands weren't entirely steady as she opened it. Inside was a letter, written before her death, naming Claire directly as the intended recipient of $18,000 from the family savings, in recognition of years of care no one else had provided. That money had never reached her. When Claire lined up the dates, the timing was unmistakable. The exact window her grandmother's estate had settled matched, almost to the month, an unexplained deposit into the business account, followed by withdrawals tied to the expansion project Daniel had pushed for and later abandoned. Her inheritance hadn't vanished. It had been spent quietly by her own parents to bail out the sibling who'd always come first. Going back through the original loan paperwork tied to the expansion, Claire noticed something else entirely. A signature on one authorization form that was supposed to be Robert's, but didn't match any of the dozens of other signatures she'd seen on hospital forms that same week. She had it compared, informally, against an old signed birthday card of her father's. It wasn't close. Whether Daniel had forged it himself or simply let it happen without correcting the record, the document had authorized a withdrawal Robert almost certainly never approved, which meant this had crossed, at some point, from a family failing to communicate into something a prosecutor could actually call a crime. That discovery forced a decision Claire hadn't expected to face. She could take the forged signature to the police and turn a private family failure into a criminal case, one that could follow Daniel for the rest of his life. Or she could use it privately, as leverage to guarantee repayment and force him out of the business for good, without ever involving anyone outside the family. She sat with that choice for a full day before deciding. She wasn't interested in destroying her brother. She was interested in making sure he could never again quietly help himself to what wasn't his. She chose the private path, but she made sure Daniel understood exactly what she was choosing not to do, and exactly what would happen if he ever gave her reason to reconsider. Before confronting anyone, Claire drove out alone to the cemetery where her grandmother was buried. She hadn't visited in over 3 years, and the grass around the headstone had grown ragged in a way that made her chest tighten before she'd even parked the car. Standing there in the cold, she understood something the bank statements alone couldn't show her. It wasn't only the money that had been taken. It was the one proof she'd had that someone in this family had truly seen her, and even that had quietly been spent without her ever knowing. She laid the folder on the kitchen table the next morning, statements, dates, the letter itself, and waited. When Margaret saw it, there was no confusion on her face, only the look of someone who'd been dreading this exact moment for years and had finally run out of road. "I was going to tell you," Margaret said, and Claire asked her plainly when exactly she'd planned on that. The conversation lasted almost 3 hours. Margaret admitted Robert had known less than people assumed, that the smaller day-to-day decisions had been hers alone. She admitted slowly that she and Robert had used Claire's inheritance to save Daniel's collapsing venture, telling herself at the time that Claire, independent and stable, simply wouldn't need it the way he did. Claire asked the question she'd carried for 20 years. Why was it always Daniel? Margaret's answer, for once, came without deflection. "He needed us. You never did." Claire pushed further, asking whether her mother had ever once in 22 years considered what that must have felt like from the other side. Margaret didn't answer right away. "I told myself you were fine," she finally said. "It was easier than admitting we'd made a choice we couldn't undo." Claire's independence had quietly been reframed over decades as proof she simply mattered less. Daniel had already heard, before he ever set foot in the house, that Claire was the one going through the accounts. He texted Margaret twice that week asking exactly what Claire had found, questions Margaret hadn't fully answered, which only seemed to sharpen the edge he arrived with. Robert called a family dinner 2 nights later, the first time all 3 siblings had been in the same room in over 5 years, with Emily joining by video call from across the country. It was tense from the first minute. Daniel arrived already armed with a defense: market conditions, bad timing. "I was always going to pay it back," he said, though the business he meant to pay it back with had folded entirely, leaving nothing to repay with. He accused Claire of making their father's health crisis about herself, of choosing the worst possible moment to bring up old grievances. Claire let him finish, then told him plainly that intention doesn't repay a mortgage, and that his silence had cost her years without her even knowing what had been taken from her. He didn't apologize. He simply repeated that their parents had made the decision, not him, as if accepting money he knew wasn't his erased any responsibility for keeping it. It was only when Claire quietly set the mismatched signature page on the table beside the rest of the folder that Daniel's tone finally changed. He stared at it for a long moment before asking, carefully, what exactly she intended to do with it. Claire told him the truth. She had no interest in involving the police, as long as he signed away any further claim to the business and agreed to a repayment schedule for what he'd taken, starting immediately. If he didn't, the folder would go to someone whose job it was to decide whether a father's forged signature on a loan document was a family matter or a criminal one. Daniel signed everything she put in front of him that same night. Though he made sure everyone at the table understood, he still considered himself the injured party in all of it. Emily, watching from a laptop screen propped against a stack of books, stayed mostly quiet through the worst of the argument, occasionally offering a soft, "I didn't know it was that bad," that satisfied no one. She offered something close to sympathy, an apology for not being in a position to help, and a clear, unspoken signal that she had no intention of stepping any closer to the mess than she already had. There was no cruelty in it, only distance, the same distance that had defined her role in this family for years. Robert, for the first time that night, spoke up without being asked. He looked at Daniel and said simply that he should have asked more questions years ago, and looked at Claire and said he was sorry it had taken almost losing everything for him to finally see what had actually happened to her. When Daniel tried to interrupt him, Robert, still weak from the hospital, told his son flatly to let his sister finish. The first time in either of their lives that Robert had taken Claire's side over Daniel's in front of the whole family. For a moment, sitting at that table, Claire considered simply writing a check large enough to make the immediate crisis disappear and walking away for good, no terms, no confrontation, no further entanglement with any of them. It would have been faster. It also would have changed nothing, leaving her exactly where she'd always been in this family, useful only when convenient and invisible the rest of the time. Faced with a brother who offered excuses instead of accountability, and a sister who offered distance instead of help, Claire made the decision that would define everything after. She didn't walk away, though every year of exclusion told her she had every right to. Instead, she set terms in front of all of them that night. She would stabilize the finances, but only if she controlled the accounts herself. The inheritance would be repaid as a debt, in monthly installments, before another dollar went anywhere else. Daniel would be formally removed from any financial authority over the business, and she would no longer accept being treated as an afterthought in her own family. She had the attorney she'd met with earlier draft the repayment agreement formally, with fixed monthly amounts and a clear default clause, precisely so nothing in this arrangement could later be quietly renegotiated the way everything else in this family always had been. Robert signed what needed to be signed the next morning, and for the first time in Claire's adult life, treated her decisions as final rather than something to be quietly renegotiated later. Word of what happened reached the wider family within weeks. An aunt named Patricia, Margaret's older sister, called Claire directly, something she'd never once done in 20 years. She admitted she'd watched the favoritism play out at every holiday gathering for decades and had always told herself it wasn't her place to say anything. She apologized for that silence now, plainly, without excuses, and Claire found the apology meant more coming from someone who'd simply witnessed it than it ever could have from someone who'd caused it. Other relatives sided instinctively with Daniel, more uncomfortable with his exposure than with what he'd actually done, repeating the same line Claire had heard her whole life, that family was supposed to forgive and move on. Claire found she cared less about any of it than she once might have. Through all of it, Thomas stayed on the other end of a phone every night, listening to the day's developments without ever telling her what to do. On the night Claire found the forged signature, she called him from the driveway before she could even walk back inside, and he simply let her talk until she'd said everything out loud once and could finally go back in and face it calmly. He reminded her, more than once during those weeks, that she didn't owe her parents forgiveness just because she'd chosen to help them, and that the two things could exist entirely separately. Claire spent an entire morning at the bank branch downtown, sitting across from a loan officer who clearly hadn't expected the daughter to be the one negotiating a repayment plan instead of the parents themselves. She worked out a modified schedule that cleared the missed payments over 6 months instead of forcing an immediate lump sum, using her own income as the guarantee the bank actually wanted to see. It was the kind of unglamorous, patient negotiation nobody puts in a family story, and it was also the single thing that kept her parents in that house at all. Over the months that followed, Claire brought the mortgage current, separated Daniel from any further financial control, and arranged her own repayment in structured installments, a debt finally honored rather than a gift reluctantly returned. Daniel moved out of state within the year, distancing himself from a family that no longer saw him the way it once had. He called Claire exactly once after that, nearly a year later, asking if the signed agreement and the forged document could simply be destroyed now that the repayment was underway, framing it as a fresh start he thought he'd earned. Claire told him the agreement stayed exactly where it was for as long as the repayment did, and that trust, once spent the way he'd spent it, didn't get refunded just because enough time had passed. He didn't call again after that. Word came back later that he'd started another small venture, funded this time entirely on his own, still insisting privately that he'd been treated unfairly. Emily's distance never closed, but it stopped being an open wound and became simply a known limitation, an occasional text at holidays instead of silence. When Claire mentioned once that she'd expected at least an offer of help during the worst of it, Emily's answer was quiet and, for once, honest. She said she'd built her entire adult life around staying far enough away that this family could never again make her feel the way it had when she was younger, and that keeping that distance meant keeping it from everyone, Claire included, whether that was fair to her or not. It wasn't the answer Claire wanted, but it was the only one that actually made sense of years of silence that had nothing to do with cruelty at all. In the first few months after the dinner, Margaret's calls still carried a defensive edge, quick to explain a decision before Claire could question it, still bracing for blame even when none was coming. Slowly, that changed. She began calling more unprompted photos from doctor's appointments, small thank yous for bills Claire hadn't even asked about, out of something that started to resemble real effort rather than obligation. The clearest sign of how much had actually shifted came almost 2 years later, when Margaret called Claire not about a bill or a doctor's appointment, but simply to ask her opinion on a decision about selling a small piece of land the family had held onto for decades. It was a small thing. It was also the first time in Claire's entire life that her mother had asked for her judgment on anything before the decision had already been made without her. Robert, in the years that followed, became the one who called just to talk, no crisis attached, something that had never once happened before that 6 a.m. phone call changed everything. Claire remembered, distinctly, the drive home after the last of the paperwork was finally signed, the folder of statements and agreements sitting on the passenger seat beside her instead of scattered across her parents' kitchen table. She didn't feel triumphant the way she might have imagined at 17, dreaming of some final vindication. She felt mostly tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, the particular exhaustion of finally putting down something she'd been carrying, unspoken, for over 2 decades. Thomas met her in the driveway when she pulled in, and neither of them said much of anything. There wasn't much left to say. The work was done, the terms were set, and for the first time in her adult life, Claire had walked out of that house on her own schedule, not theirs. She thought, more than once in the weeks that followed, about how differently the whole story could have ended if she'd simply let that first call go to voicemail. Nobody would have blamed her. Plenty of people in her position never would have picked up at all, and would have been just as justified either way. What kept pulling her back wasn't guilt, and it wasn't some deep, unspoken hope that her parents would finally become different people. It was closer to a question she needed answered for herself, about who she wanted to be when the people who owed her the least amount of grace were the ones asking for the most of it. She got her answer, eventually, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow accumulation of decisions she made entirely on her own terms, one folder, one signature, one boundary at a time. Whatever this family became after that, it would never again be one that could simply assume her presence without earning it first. 3 years later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, Robert asked Claire to sit with him on the back porch, the same porch where, decades earlier, he'd told a much younger Claire that the college money was already spoken for. He didn't bring up that memory directly. He simply thanked her plainly for not giving up on this family entirely when he knew she'd had every reason to. The house was long since safe, the business smaller but solvent under new management, and Claire's place in the family was no longer something assigned to her by people who'd once decided how much she was allowed to matter. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. The warmth was careful, rebuilt on new boundaries rather than old affection recovered. But it was hers, built entirely on her own terms, and it was the first version of this family she had ever actually chosen for herself. What this story really comes down to is simple. Families don't always show you who they value through what they say. They show you through who they call first when everything falls apart, and who they expect to just understand why they were called last. So here's the question worth sitting with. If you were Claire, would you have answered that call?